The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above Norfolk Union Station's medical clinic, a narrow cavity wedged between platforms where the city's broken people arrived at 3 a.m. with twisted ankles and chest pain nobody wanted to hear about. Elena Martinez pushed a cart of supplies down the cramped hallway, her combat boots silent on the tile despite their weight, observing the room the way she observed everything, the way a sniper observes a valley before the first shot. The clinic was understaffed by design, underfunded by accident, and overseen by Dr. Richard Mercer, whose voice carried the particular cruelty of a man who had never been told no and intended to keep it that way. The smell of antiseptic mixed with stale coffee. The ventilator in Bay 3 wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Elena's hands, scarred across the knuckles and palms in patterns that told stories nobody asked about, moved with precise efficiency as she restocked the trauma cart, gauze pads, saline bags, a 14-gauge angiocath needle. She checked the inventory log on her tablet, columns of numbers that would have gone unnoticed if she were the kind of nurse who didn't pay attention. But Elena paid attention to everything. It was the habit of someone who had learned that inattention cost lives, and she had learned that lesson in the Hindu Kush at 8,400 feet above sea level, where the air was thin and the consequences were permanent. A homeless veteran named Marcus came in at 2:13 a.m. with a blood pressure reading that made Elena move into high alert. 190/110. The man's hands trembled as he tried to explain the chest tightness, and Elena's voice dropped into that register she reserved for the truly frightened. "You're safe. We're going to help." She gestured for him to sit, and he collapsed into the chair like gravity had suddenly tripled. She was reaching for the pulse oximeter when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway, his presence announcing itself before his voice did, a pressure change in the room like a storm front moving in from the Atlantic. "Again?" Mercer said. He didn't raise his voice. The cruelty in his tone required no volume. "You're wasting supplies on this demographic again, aren't you?" Elena didn't pause. The pulse ox clipped onto Marcus's finger. 92% oxygen saturation. Not ideal. She was already reaching for the nasal cannula. "His BP is critical. We need an EKG." "We need a lot of things," Mercer said, stepping into the bay with his arms crossed. "We need a budget that doesn't hemorrhage money on people who sleep in train stations." He looked directly at Marcus, and the look was the kind that made people smaller. "You have insurance, or are we just charity care tonight?" Marcus couldn't answer. His hands were still trembling. Elena placed the nasal cannula at 2 liters per minute and turned to Mercer with the flat, cold stare that had become her default when dealing with men who confused cruelty with authority. 12-lead EKG. Now. Or we wait for the liability when his MI happens in the station and we have documentation that we refused treatment. The room went dead silent. Mercer's face darkened. But he didn't argue about the EKG. He turned and left, and Elena exhaled once through her nose, controlled, quiet, and returned to Marcus with steady hands. The EKG told the story: ST elevation in the anterior leads. Acute myocardial infarction. Elena had seen this pattern before, under worse conditions, in places where the nearest hospital was 47 kilometers away and helicopters couldn't fly at night. She had kept a man alive with a tourniquet and prayer for 3 hours until dust-off arrived. She had learned that panic killed faster than blood loss, so she kept her voice level as she spoke into her radio. Incoming acute MI, male, 58, hypertensive. Preparing for transfer. She was still focused on Marcus when the memory came unbidden, the way memories did when your hands were steady enough to work and your mind was therefore free to wander backward. 8 years ago. The mountains of Cunha province. Her team had been 2 days behind schedule, and Sergeant James Patterson had been checking a building they shouldn't have needed to check. The IED had been old, but old didn't matter. Dead was dead. Elena had carried him 3 miles through terrain that wanted to kill her before his wounds did, his blood soaking through her uniform in patterns she could still see if she closed her eyes. She had kept him talking. She had kept him breathing. She had kept him alive for 28 minutes after the explosion, which was 28 minutes longer than anyone said was possible. At his funeral, she had folded the flag they handed her and never unfolded it again. It still lived in her locker, wrapped in plastic, tucked behind her spare uniform, her talisman, her reminder, the weight she carried that nobody could see. The ambulance arrived at 2:51 a.m. Elena walked Marcus to the bay doors and stayed until the paramedics took over, her hand briefly on his shoulder. "You're going to be fine," she said. She meant it. She had learned to mean it by refusing to accept the alternative. When she returned to the clinic, the break room held 3 other staff members, 2 nurses and a respiratory tech, gathered around the refrigerator like they were planning something. Elena opened the fridge to retrieve the sandwich she'd packed 12 hours ago, and the room simultaneously emptied. The respiratory tech left first, his shoes squeaking on the tile. One nurse followed, and the other made a show of checking her watch before she also drifted away. None of them looked at Elena. None of them said goodbye. Elena sat alone at the break room table with her sandwich and didn't flinch at the exile. She had been isolated by better men than these, in worse places, for better reasons. This was just the station's way of telling her she didn't belong. But belonging had never been the point. 43 minutes later, she was back in the clinic checking supplies when she noticed something that made her pause. The 4-fluid inventory log showed 8 bags of normal saline leaving the clinic in the past week, but the patient charts only accounted for 4. The trauma cart showed 3 cardiac monitor batteries marked as used, but she had replaced them just once. The numbers didn't align, and Elena's mind worked like a calculator with perfect recall, trained, relentless, impossible to fool. She opened her inventory tablet and pulled the billing records for the past month. Cedar Creek Medical Supply account showed premium equipment being charged to the station's account at rates that made no sense. High-end diagnostic monitors. Specialized ventilator modules. Equipment that Elena had never seen arrive and never seen used. Her hands moved across the tablet screen, documenting everything, her scarred fingers precise against the glass. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere above, a train announced its arrival with a mechanical announcement that echoed through the station like a warning nobody understood. She had been placed at Norfolk Union Station for a reason, though the people who had placed her there believed their secret was buried deep enough. She was supposed to be invisible. Supposed to blend into the rhythm of the clinic and wait. But invisible people notice things, and Elena had just noticed something that Dr. Mercer very much wanted to stay buried. The question was whether she would find out what he intended to do about it before he found out that she already knew. Her inventory logs were growing too accurate. Her documentation too meticulous. Her presence at the station too dangerous to his arrangement. Elena opened the break room refrigerator and threw away the sandwich nobody had watched her eat. Outside, beyond the station's windows, the city slept under sodium lights and rain that fell like gunfire on the glass. The sandwich sat in a trash beneath paper towels Elena had used to clean the microwave. Tuesday night at Norfolk Union Station stretched thin, 11:48 p.m., the platforms emptying, the medical clinic fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of old bone. She stood in the corridor between the break room and Trauma Bay 1, her inventory clipboard heavy as a confession. Dr. Mercer rounded the corner moving fast, his loafers clicking against tile like a countdown. Behind him came a family, a woman in a red coat, 2 teenage daughters, and an older man clutching his left arm. Elena recognized the pattern before she recognized his face. Jaw tight. Shoulder rigid. The particular way men held their breath before the heart broke. "Get him in Bay 1. Now," Elena said. She was already moving, already reaching for the portable EKG machine mounted on the wall. "That's where the competent staff work," Mercer said. The man's daughters stared. Elena's hands did not pause. She ran the lead from the machine, 12 electrodes, precision-mapped across the chest wall, while Mercer stood in the doorway with his arms crossed like a critic at a performance. The EKG printed. The pattern emerged. Anterior wall. Acute. The kind that kills men in the time it takes to dial 911. "Get me a 12-gauge angiocath and a 500 cubic centimeters bolus of normal saline," Elena said. She was not asking. The clinic nurse, younger, terrified, moved without thinking. "I'll take this patient," Mercer announced to the family. My nurse here tends to panic under pressure. Last week she wasted an entire unit of medication on a patient who wasn't even admitted. The woman in the red coat looked at Elena, then at Mercer, then back. Elena had the foreign before her second breath. The vein cooperated. The flash of blood in the chamber. The catheter threading home like it had done this 1,000 times because her hands had. She gave aspirin to someone with a bleeding ulcer, Mercer continued, his voice pitched for the daughters to hear clearly. No authorization. No consultation. Just decided she knew better than the physician. He turned to Elena. You understand protocols exist for a reason, or does that concept exceed your pay grade? Elena twisted the four-cap home. Fluid running clear. She looked up from the patient's arm and met Mercer's eyes. Not with anger that burned. With anger that froze. The kind of stare you give someone and they feel the temperature drop. His blood pressure is 89/56 and crashing, she said quietly. You should probably not be standing in the doorway. Mercer's face reddened. He did not move. Elena ran the saline wide open, watching the bag collapse like a lung deflating. The monitor showed the rhythm, erratic, angry, the electrical storm of a heart drowning in its own tissue damage. She had seen this pattern before. Not in Norfolk. In Kandahar. In the back of a Black Hawk at altitude where the air was thin and soldiers bled out on stretchers and she kept them alive with her hands. I need a crash cart standing by, Elena said to the clinic nurse. And call for ambulance ETA. Who gave you authority to? Mercer started. The patient is seizing, Elena said. She was not incorrect. The man's hand had begun to twitch, the electrical chaos in his heart now writing itself across his entire nervous system. His wife moved toward him and Elena caught her wrist gently. Not now. He needs space. Mercer finally left. Elena worked. The saline ran. The monitor beeped its irregular rhythm. 8 minutes until the ambulance arrived, she could hear the radio chatter from the station platform, the dispatcher's calm voice confirming location and priority. She had kept men breathing with worse odds. She had done a field thoracotomy in the Hindu Kush with a combat knife in her hands and nothing else, and this man in the red coat's wife would not die tonight if Elena's competence meant anything at all. The ambulance crew came in fast. She gave them the summary in 12 words. Anterior STEMI, symptomatic, IV access established, 2 boluses running. They loaded him with the efficiency of people who understood the language. His wife followed. The daughters looked back once at Elena, who was already washing her hands at the sink, the soap running warm against skin that never showed what she felt. 3 hours later, Elena sat in the break room with a container of rice and vegetables she had bought at the station market. The clinic staff had already claimed the table, the younger nurse, the phlebotomist, someone from the front desk. They were discussing a supervisor's upcoming wedding. Elena pulled out a chair. Saturday. The evacuation was immediate. Not rude. Professional. They gathered phones and napkins and coffee cups. The younger nurse left a single sentence hanging, "We're going to eat lunch in the parking lot before the shift gets busy again." Nobody looked at Elena as they filed past. She ate the rice without tasting it. The break room hummed with fluorescent light. A vending machine compressor kicked on and off in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and she let the mechanical precision of the room become the only sound worth hearing. Dr. Mercer found her on the way out of her shift, 6:38 a.m., when the morning staff was arriving and the night people were disappearing like ghosts. He held a paper, the kind of pristine white that only came from the printer on the administrative desk. "You'll see that I've posted a disciplinary notice on the unit board," he said. His voice had the tone of someone announcing a verdict. Unauthorized medication use. Aspirin administered without physician authorization to patient Michael Chen, Tuesday night. This is the second incident in 4 weeks. Elena read the notice. Her name on it like an accusation. Unauthorized medication use. The word sat there in Arial font, official enough to burn. The patient had a heart attack, Elena said. Aspirin thins the blood. You had no way of knowing his medical history. That's my job. Your job is to take vitals and call physicians. Not to practice medicine. She held the notice. The paper felt thin. Easy to tear. Easy to crumple. Easy to make disappear. I understand, she said. She did not sound like someone who understood. She sounded like someone counting. Mercer left her there in the corridor with the notice, expecting something, anger maybe, or tears, or a protest that would let him feel righteous about firing her next. Elena walked to the unit board and tacked the notice in the exact center, then turned and found his eyes across the span of the clinic. The only protocol you follow is cashing checks you didn't earn, she said. Her voice was level. No heat. No tremor. Just fact being stated to someone who had forgotten how to listen. She walked away. Behind her, Mercer stood frozen with his mouth slightly open, understanding too late that the woman he had been trying to break for 3 weeks had just looked directly at him and given him his future. Not as a promise. As a prophecy. The rain started before Elena reached the parking lot, cold and deliberate, the kind of rain that came from the Atlantic and carried the smell of salt and something older, brine and storm pressure and the weight of things that could not be unseen. She stood for 6 minutes under the sodium lights, letting it soak through her scrubs, through the thin fabric of her certainty, into the place where she kept the flag folded and the memory of the medic who had taught her that protocols were written by people who had never held someone while they died. And then her phone vibrated. A text from a number with no name attached. Just coordinates. Just 4 words, report to Federal Building. Platform 7 was empty. Tuesday evening, 6:19 p.m., the commuter crush already thinned to stragglers and the occasional business traveler checking their phone. Elena was restocking the clinic's depleted supply cabinet, again, when the sound came. Not a scream. Worse. A sound like a melon hitting concrete, then the wet percussion of something heavy colliding with maintenance equipment bolted to the track bed. She didn't think. Her legs moved first, muscle memory older than her nursing license. The clinic door swung open hard enough to bang the wall. Down the corridor, through the platform gate, down the metal stairs in 3 strides. The EMTs from the mobile unit parked at the north entrance stood frozen, radios forgotten at their sides, staring at what lay 20 feet below them on the track. A man. Chest caved in where the maintenance scaffolding had caught him during his fall. Blood pooled beneath his left shoulder like spilled wine. His right arm hung at an angle that meant multiple fractures. His mouth opened and closed, working on a breath that wouldn't come. Elena jumped. Not climbed. Jumped the 6-foot gap and landed hard beside him, the impact jarring up through her ankles in a way that told her she'd feel that for a week. If she had a week. The man's eyes locked onto hers, conscious, aware, terrified in the way of someone watching their own death arrive. Get me a 14-gauge needle and an 4 kit, she called up to the EMTs, her voice dropping an octave. Now. Not the clinic supplies. The ambulance. Move. They didn't move. Shock was a real thing. Elena didn't wait. Her hands were already assessing, fingers pressing along ribs, feeling the damage beneath the torn fabric of his shirt. Pneumothorax. Hemothorax. The left lung had collapsed like a punctured balloon. Blood filled the space where air should have been. O2 saturation dropping. She could hear it in his breathing, the absence of breath on one side, the wheeze on the other. Water, she said quietly. I need water. Now. One of the EMTs snapped awake. He descended the ladder in jerking, mechanical movements. Elena's fingers found the tactical knife in her scrub pocket, the one item from her past she'd never abandoned, the one Mercer had mocked when he found it during a uniform inspection 2 months ago. Carrying weapons into a civilian medical facility, Captain, he'd sneered, then laughed at the rank she hadn't corrected him about. She'd never told him what she actually was. The knife stayed. Her hands moved on their own. 15 years of training doesn't wait for permission. She found the space between the man's 4th and 5th ribs, mid-axillary line. Marked it with her left thumb. The knife was sharp enough that she didn't have to saw. One motion, angled upward. Muscle memory. The hiss of air escaping, not a scream from him, just a desperate gasp as his lung re-expanded. That sound was her lodestar. The hiss of a man breathing again. O2 sat climbing, she murmured, though there was no monitor. She could hear it in his breathing. In the color returning to his lips. 68, she felt it in the way his chest was moving again. Felt it in the way his eyes weren't rolling back anymore. The hemothorax was worse. Blood was flooding the pleural cavity, collapsing the lung a different way. Elena's other hand went to the bleeder, fingers searching through torn muscle and fractured rib until she found it, the source. A vessel torn clean. Without a surgical clamp, without the equipment that Cedar Creek Medical's main trauma bay would have, she had hands and pressure and her body understanding the physics of bleeding the way it understood breathing. She pressed. Held. The man's breathing stabilized. 72, 78. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her fingers, not the panicked hammer of 5 minutes ago. Slower. More organized. 82. We need an airway, she said. Someone needs to call ahead. Level 1 trauma activation. Notify Cedar Creek that we've got a massive hemothorax with rib fractures. Possible tension pneumothorax if he decompensates. Move now. The EMTs weren't moving. They were staring at her hands, at the way she'd cracked a man's chest open with a utility knife, at the blood and the clarity and the thing that had changed about her voice. The deferential nurse who restocked supplies and accepted Mercer's insults was gone. What stood beside that man was something else entirely. Now means now, Elena said. Not a request. A command. They moved. She didn't let go. Couldn't let go. The second her pressure eased, that vessel would tear further, and 8 minutes of careful work would become a fatal hemorrhage in under 90 seconds. The man's eyes were on hers now, consciousness returning as the suffocation stopped. He couldn't speak. The best he could do was blink, and she could read the blink. Thank you. Stay. Don't let go. I've got you, Elena whispered. You're not dying on platform 7. The rain started then, fine mist that turned the blood on her hands dark. Her knees ached from the pressure of kneeling on the concrete. Her right shoulder burned, old injury, Hindu Kush, when shrapnel had carved through muscle and left her with permanent nerve damage that throbbed in weather like this. She ignored it. Pain was information. Pain was data. This pain meant she was still vertical, still holding pressure, still keeping him alive. That was the other thing about Mercer he'd never understand. He'd seen her flinch when he screamed at her during shift changes. He'd watched her accept his blame for equipment shortages that were his financial arrangements. He'd thought her compliance was weakness. What he'd missed, what everyone missed, was the difference between choosing not to fight and being unable to fight. Elena had been trained by the 75th Ranger Regiment to move through enemy fire and keep people alive at the same time. Mercer was a station manager with a superiority complex and a billing scheme. She'd been waiting for something harder than him her entire career. The stretcher descended. 2 paramedics, real ones this time, trained ones who understood what they were looking at because they'd seen field medicine before, worked emergency services in places where civilians and combat zones became the same thing. One of them, older, calloused, with the bearing of someone who'd carried worse, looked at her hands, at the position she'd maintained, at the wound she'd treated with a pocket knife and willpower. Medic? He asked. Army, Elena said. Carried a wounded ranger 3 miles through Helmand province with a bullet in my hip and his left arm bleeding out. That wasn't what she said out loud. What she said was, get him airway management. Push 1 milligram epi if his pressure tanks. We're looking at a 6-minute transport window before I lose him. Copy that, the paramedic said. And he didn't question her. He just nodded and moved like someone taking orders from command. She transferred the pressure to his hands with a precision that required her hands to overlap his for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds where both of them held the bleeding vessel. 3 seconds where the man's life was supported by 5 hands instead of 2. Then she stepped back and let them move him. O2 sat was 88 now. Climbing. Stable. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was every protocol and every training and every rule about maintaining distance and staying invisible and being just a nurse, folded up into her tendons and muscles and nerve endings with nowhere to go. The shaking was what happened when a warrior tried to fit into scrubs and ID badges and a station clinic that had expired supplies and a manager who thought medical work was an expense to minimize. As the stretcher lifted toward the ambulance, the paramedic looked back at her once more. Really looked at her. And for just a moment, the briefest fraction of a second, Elena's sleeve rode up. The tattoo was small, dark, positioned on the inside of her wrist where it wouldn't show during normal clinic rotations. A call sign. Not her civilian name. The name they'd screamed over radio when she was the only one between them and an ambush. The name that mattered when names stopped meaning anything except survival. The paramedic's eyes widened just slightly. He didn't say anything. But he saw it. And Elena knew, with the cold certainty that came from years of reading threat assessment and tactical situations, that this man had colleagues. That paramedics talked. That word traveled through emergency services networks faster than any official report. What she didn't know, what nobody on Platform 7 knew, was that the Army Ranger she was standing above, the one whose chest she'd just held together with her hands and a tactical knife, had her same call sign tattooed on his right arm. That he'd been placed at Norfolk Union Station as a routine escort through civilian infrastructure. That every week for the past 4 months, he'd passed through the clinic for a wellness check that was never about wellness. That he'd never connected the exhausted night shift nurse to the soldier he'd carried on his back while she returned fire with her left hand and held his femoral artery closed with her right. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what was about to change everything. Because somewhere in the station's administrative files, buried in the background check that Mercer had initiated just to find ammunition against her, a single line flagged in red. A classified security clearance that matched no civilian nursing credential. A rank designation that had no business appearing on the personnel roster of a train station clinic. A name that belonged to someone who was supposed to be dead, or disappeared, or at minimum somewhere far more important than restocking trauma supplies in Norfolk. The system had seen her. And in 3 hours, when the background check results reached the right desk at the right agency, people with very different badges and very different authority than Mercer would start asking questions. Elena picked up her tactical knife from the platform. Cleaned it on her scrub pants. Slid it back into her pocket where it had waited through months of humiliation, through Mercer's contempt, through the systematic isolation of a break room that emptied when she arrived. She climbed the ladder back to Platform 7. The EMTs didn't speak to her. One of them was already on his radio, reporting vitals and ETA. The paramedic was gone. The rain was getting heavier, turning the platform into something that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and Elena walked back toward the clinic with her hands still shaking with the violence of restraint. She had no idea what was about to happen. But her hands knew. Her hands had been holding a weapon and a wound and a secret for long enough. Pretty soon those hands were going to have to choose what they held onto next. The siren wailed across Platform 7 for exactly 43 seconds before silence swallowed it whole. Elena had moved the patient to the clinic's resuscitation bay, the one room Mercer actually kept stocked with decent equipment, and her hands had finished what her voice could never say. Monitor showed sinus rhythm. Clean, steady, perfect. The trauma was stabilized. The bleeding clamped. The impossible made possible. The paramedic stood frozen in the doorway, staring at her hands. One of them, the one who'd seen the tattoo when her sleeve rode up during compressions, opened his mouth and closed it twice before stepping back into the corridor. "You're bleeding." Her fellow nurse, Patricia, pointed at Elena's scrubs. 3 inches of dark seeping across her abdomen where the patient's fractured rib had caught her during the procedure. Elena looked down. Gloved her hands off. "It's his blood." Not mine. But Patricia was already stepping closer, already reaching for the fabric. Elena, we need to. I'm fine. 2 words. A door closing. Elena turned back to the monitor, checking the drip rate on the level 1 rapid infuser they'd finally found in the cabinet behind the locked cupboard Mercer kept his expensive equipment in. The one he claimed was empty. The patient's eyes flickered, consciousness arriving in fragments. His hand found the edge of the gurney and his fingers tightened, searching for something to hold onto that was real. Elena shifted without thinking, moving into his line of sight, her body a constant in the fog of morphine and trauma. His lips moved. No sound at first. Then, barely audible, Reaper 6. The room contracted. Patricia gasped. The paramedic in the doorway, the one with decent observational skills, stepped back another pace. Elena kept her voice level, borderline professional. Wrong person. But she'd seen his eyes sharpen despite the drugs. The flicker of recognition that meant everything was about to collapse. His arm ranger patch. The way he'd reached for her. The fact that he knew her call sign at all. She'd been in place at Norfolk Union Station's medical clinic for 437 days. Her assignment was simple: observe the Army Ranger asset who passed through twice weekly, traveling via the transit system between Walter Reed and a classified briefing location 40 miles north. He was her responsibility. Her mission. Her reason for wearing scrubs instead of tactical gear and pretending that her most advanced trauma medicine came from YouTube videos and night school. Everything depended on her cover remaining intact. Everything was about to detonate. Dr. Mercer arrived 18 minutes after the platform evacuation alert reached administrative. He stood in the resuscitation bay doorway with his arms folded, taking in the scene like a man watching his entire world rearrange itself without his permission. The patient was sedated now, stable, prepped for surgical transport to the Level 1 trauma center in Portsmouth. The crisis was over. The impossible had been accomplished. And it had happened without his authorization, without his presence, without him. Elena was documenting vitals when he spoke. Step out. Now. She didn't look up from the chart. Finished the heart rate notation. Set the pen down. Stood with the kind of mechanical precision that made it clear she'd heard him but hadn't acknowledged him. That was the distinction that mattered. Hearing and honoring were 2 entirely different transactions. In the corridor outside the resuscitation bay, with Patricia and 2 paramedics and a transit security officer all within earshot, Mercer's voice dropped into the register he reserved for public humiliation. Do you understand what you've done? Elena turned to face him. Her hands at her sides. Her expression flat as concrete. You administered Class 2 medications without physician authorization. You opened the restricted equipment cabinet without requesting keys. You performed an invasive procedure with a non-medical instrument. He stepped closer, his voice rising with each accusation. You violated every protocol in this clinic. Every single one. The patient was exsanguinating. Elena's voice didn't rise. Didn't waver. Remained exactly level with the fluorescent hum of the corridor lights. I had for minutes before cardiac arrest. You weren't here. Which is precisely why you should have called for an attending physician instead of playing trauma surgeon with a fucking knife. Mercer's face was mottled now, the color of a man whose authority had just been shattered in front of witnesses. You're fired. Effective immediately. Clear your locker. We'll mail your final check. Elena didn't flinch. Didn't ask to appeal. Didn't defend herself. She simply nodded, a single downward tilt of her head that somehow managed to convey absolute dismissal, and walked past him toward the staff area. What he didn't know was that his words had already been calculated by someone far more dangerous than a hospital administrator. What he couldn't see was the cascade he'd triggered the moment he decided to make an example of the quiet nurse who kept meticulous records of his supply room discrepancies. By sunset, Mercer had made for phone calls to board members. By 9 p.m., he'd contacted the references on Elena's nursing license application with carefully worded concerns about her stability, her judgment, her psychological fitness for healthcare. By 10:13 p.m., he'd brought in an outside investigator from a firm that specialized in healthcare compliance audits and slipped the investigator a summary of Elena's patient care logs, pointing at the thoracotomy procedure as evidence of dangerous decision-making. He was activating his network, weaponizing his allies, building a fortress of institutional pressure that would ensure Elena Martinez never worked as a nurse in Virginia again. He had no idea she was Army. No concept that every one of those meticulous records he'd just handed to investigators contained evidence of his own fraud, supply room thefts worth $87,000 over 18 months. No understanding that the woman he'd just fired had been documenting his crimes with the precision of someone trained to gather intelligence. And he absolutely had no awareness that by calling those board members, by contacting those references, by bringing in that investigator, he'd set in motion the exact machinery that would eventually dismantle him completely. Elena cleared her locker at 11:22 p.m. Nobody came to watch. The break room remained empty of the staff who'd learned long ago to exit when she entered. She removed 3 items from the metal cabinet, a cracked coffee mug from Fort Campbell's Exchange, a dying succulent in a ceramic pot, and a photograph in a plastic sleeve, her medic, Jackson, holding the folded flag from his final mission in the Hindu Kush. The flag she still carried in the zipped pocket of her civilian jacket. The flag she touched every morning before clocking in, the way other people touched crucifixes or lucky pennies. The cardboard box they gave her was institutional grey, the kind used for shipping supplies. She placed the objects inside and didn't look back. The rain started as she reached the transit station at 12:31 a.m. Not the kind of rain that fell, the kind that descended in sheets, turning the pavement into a temporary creek. Elena stood under the bus stop shelter with her cardboard box and her possessions and absolutely no plan for what came next. The overnight buses ran every 22 minutes. She had enough cash for 3 days of a cheap motel. Enough credit card room for a week, maybe, if she was careful. The assignment was over. Mission failure. Her cover was compromised by Mercer's investigation before it had even begun. Within 72 hours, those outside auditors would cross-reference her references and discover the inconsistencies. Her DoD security clearance would surface. The entire carefully constructed identity would collapse like a structure built on sand. She sat on the bench outside the shelter, the cardboard box beside her. The rain hammered the metal roof of the shelter in a rhythm that sounded like automatic weapons fire, 3-round bursts, the way her unit used to train. Her hands weren't shaking. Soldiers didn't shake. But her hands were ice, and her chest felt like someone had replaced her lungs with concrete, and the thought that kept returning was the simplest and most devastating one: maybe they were right. Maybe she wasn't cut out for civilian work. Maybe pretending to be normal was the hardest mission she'd ever run. Maybe the quiet nurse was the biggest lie she'd ever told, and Mercer had been smart enough to see through it. She opened the cardboard box, looked at Jackson's photograph. His smile was the kind that came from genuine happiness, not performance. He'd been holding that flag and believing that something mattered. Believing that the mission meant something. Believing that the people you served with would always have your back, even after the worst happened. Especially after the worst happened. Elena's eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. So she didn't. She just pressed the photograph to her chest and watched the rain and tried to remember who she was when nobody was watching. When there was no mission. When there was no assignment and no cover and no reason to keep standing. The rain fell harder. A stranger approached with an umbrella, an elderly woman, probably heading to the night shift at Cedar Creek. Elena shook her head. The woman hesitated, then left the umbrella against the shelter's pole before boarding the arriving bus. Elena didn't pick it up. Didn't move. Just sat with the cardboard box and the photograph and the weight of having failed before she'd even started. And then she heard it. The sound was impossible in this weather. The distinctive percussion of rotor blades cutting through rain-thick air, growing louder, moving closer. Elena's head lifted. The bus stop lights flickered, The shelter began to vibrate, and three shapes emerged from the darkness, UH-60M Blackhawks, constellation lights bleeding through the downpour, coming in hot with the kind of precision that meant military-grade navigation systems and pilots who'd done this in worse weather. The rotor wash hit the shelter like a physical force. Elena stood without thinking. The cardboard box tumbled. The photograph scattered across the wet pavement, Jackson's smile disappearing into the rain. And then the helicopters banked, and below them, moving up the access road with the kind of controlled speed that meant experienced drivers, a convoy of 4 black Suburbans with government plates cut through the transit station entrance. She had no idea what was about to happen next. The black Suburbans pulled through the transit station entrance and cut across the employee lot with the kind of precision that made security guards step aside without being asked. Elena was still holding the cardboard box. Still sitting on the bench. Still wearing scrubs stained with someone else's blood. The rain had stopped, but her shoulders were soaked through, and the folded flag inside the box felt heavier than when she'd packed it that morning. 4 men in tactical gear emerged first. They moved with the fluid grace of people trained to clear rooms, their eyes scanning the platform with the kind of attention that missed nothing. They wore federal badges on lanyards and carried themselves like predators in business casual. Behind them came a general officer in dress blues, his chest a topography of medals that caught the station lights. Behind him, a Pentagon liaison with a sealed folder and the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The transit authorities' background check had come through exactly 23 minutes ago. Elena knew because she'd watched the timestamp on her phone as the military email arrived. Standard vetting for a position she no longer held. Routine verification of the references that Mercer had called to destroy her. One line buried in paragraph for classified security clearance active, compartmentalized access. The background check system flagged it. The system escalated it. The system made exactly 1 phone call. Now the federal government was walking across a rain-slicked parking lot toward a fired nurse sitting on a bench with a cardboard box at 11:22 p.m. Dr. Mercer emerged from the station entrance behind them, his face already purpling with indignation. He'd been in his office when someone told him the general was coming. He'd started walking toward them immediately, his hands already moving, his mouth already forming words about proper channels and protocol violations and jurisdiction that nobody had asked him to invoke. Elena stood. The box went down on the bench. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. Her expression was the same one she wore when she was listening to a patient describe their symptoms, present, clinical, exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd stopped expecting anything at all. The Army Ranger emerged from the crowd of federal personnel before the general could speak. He was younger than Elena remembered. 26, maybe 27. His arm was out of the sling now, the wounds from the medic bag and field dressing already beginning to knit. He saw her across the platform and something shifted in his face. Recognition. Not of her face. Of something deeper. Reaper 6? His voice cracked slightly. The name came out like a prayer in a field hospital. Like calling someone back from the dead. Elena didn't confirm. Didn't move. Just looked at him the way she'd looked at 100 soldiers in the Hindu Kush when they finally understood they were going to survive. The acknowledgement was in her silence. The Marine officer stepped forward. His voice had the particular cadence of someone reading official commendations in formal settings. Captain Elena Martinez. Citation for Valor. Hindu Kush, Kuna Province, 2019. During sustained combat operations, while serving as senior medical officer for Ranger Team Alpha, Captain Martinez established forward trauma care under active fire. Of the 14 casualties evacuated under her direction, 13 survived. She performed emergency surgical intervention with limited supplies under enemy engagement, including a 3-mile emergency extraction through mountainous terrain while maintaining positive pressure ventilation on a critical patient. He paused. Each word carried weight, the kind that made the rain-slick platform feel very still. Her team was pinned down for 4 hours. She stayed with them. Every one of those soldiers walked out. That's why. The general stepped forward. His hand came up. A salute, the kind that's not a greeting but a declaration. A chest strike salute that echoed slightly in the empty station. The gesture of a superior officer recognizing another superior officer. The moment the hierarchy shifted. Mercer was still talking, his voice rising. I need to understand the proper channels for this investigation. This station has protocols. There are procedures that need. The general didn't turn. Didn't acknowledge him. Simply raised one hand, and Mercer's voice cut off as if someone had physically severed it. The silence that followed was the kind where you could hear the fluorescent lights humming above the platform. 3 seconds of silence. Then the general turned to look at Mercer the way you'd look at something stuck to the bottom of your shoe. Stand down, administrator. It wasn't a request. It was a command with the full weight of the Department of Defense behind it. The Pentagon liaison opened the folder. Captain Martinez. Your code name designation and compartmentalized access were never officially closed. Your clearance remains active. You were placed at Norfolk Union Station on assignment 19 months ago as part of an operational assessment related to the Ranger rotation patterns through this facility. Your mission status was active until this evening, when your termination triggered protocol escalation through federal databases. Elena's hands were still steady. Her breathing was still even. But something in her voice dropped an octave when she spoke. I need to know if the patient is stable. The Platform 7 trauma victim is in ICU. Stable vitals. Surgical repair confirmed at 23:14. He asked for the nurse who saved his life. We told him she was in a meeting. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound of the federal team moving through the station with the kind of purpose that cleared people out of the way. One of them was carrying a laptop. Another carried evidence bags. They moved toward the administrative office where Mercer stood, his face now the color of old hospital sheets, his mouth opening and closing on words that nobody was listening to anymore. But that wasn't the worst part for Mercer. Not yet. The Navy veteran who worked in hospital IT had recognized the flag. He'd seen Elena open her locker 3 days ago and gently remove the folded triangle of fabric, the one with the bloodstain at the corner, the one she checked on every shift at 2:22 a.m. like it might disappear if she didn't verify it was still there. He was sitting in the security office when Mercer burst in, panic climbing his throat like smoke, his hands already reaching for the security drive under his desk. I need those footage files. Platform 7. The supply room. Delete everything from the last 6 months. The IT technician, Petty Officer 3rd Class Marcus Webb, retired Navy, Purple Heart in a drawer at home, looked up from his coffee. His voice was very quiet. Already handled. Mercer's hand froze. What? Every frame. Every angle. Supply room discrepancies, equipment billing anomalies, the substitution logs. All of it. Already copied. Already forwarded to federal investigators about 40 minutes ago. Pretty much the moment I saw those federal badges walking through my station. The face Mercer made in that instant was the kind that lives in your memory. The face of someone watching their entire world compress into a single point of light and then go dark. 6 months later, Elena stood in a new clinic space at Norfolk Union Station. Cedar Creek Medical had rebuilt the Veteran Services Wing after the federal investigation concluded. The space was clean, bright, equipped with equipment that actually worked. The inventory logs were audited monthly. The patient wait times had dropped by 37%. The staff, young nurses, paramedics, veteran volunteers, moved through the clinic with the kind of respect that came from working under someone who knew exactly what she was doing. A young veteran came in that afternoon. 24 years old. Desert Storm vet's grandson. Shaking hands. The kind of shaking that came from too much adrenaline and not enough sleep and the weight of carrying something you weren't built to carry anymore. Elena didn't ask questions immediately. She sat him down. Got him water. Checked his vitals. Her hands were steady when she took his blood pressure. Her voice was measured when she started talking. And when the shaking got worse, when the young man's eye started tracking toward the window like he was looking for an exit, Elena reached into her locker and withdrew something carefully. A folded flag. The same folded flag from the cardboard box. The one with the bloodstain at the corner. This belonged to someone who saved lives, Elena said. She placed it in his hands. Someone who understood what you're carrying. Someone who made sure that the people under their watch made it home. I'm handing this to you because you're going to make it home too. You're going to carry this forward. And when you're steady enough, you're going to pass it to the next one who needs to know that someone survived before them. That someone made it through. That the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. She took the flag back when his hands stopped shaking. Refolded it with the kind of precision that comes from doing something 10,000 times. Put it back in her locker. The young veteran sat there for a long time after that, breathing. In the break room, one of the new nurses asked if Elena would take the director position. Full administrative oversight. Salary, benefits, corner office, the kind of authority that came with a title. Elena was checking the coffee maker. She didn't look up. No. But you could. I'm a nurse, Elena said. She poured 2 cups. One for herself. One for the young veteran who was still sitting in the clinic. That's what I'm here to do. The ranger with her name tattooed on his arm came back to the clinic 8 weeks after the federal arrest. He sat in the waiting area for 40 minutes before asking someone where she was. Elena was with a patient. She finished the vitals check, documented the chart, then came out to the waiting room. He stood up. I wanted to thank you, he said. For what you did on the platform. I was doing my job. No. He looked at her the way you look at someone who's been dead and isn't anymore. You were doing your calling. I've got your call sign here. He tapped his arm. Every time I look at it, I remember. Reaper 6. The reason I'm standing. Elena looked at the tattoo. The name looked smaller on his skin than it felt in her chest. She placed her hand on his shoulder, a gesture that in the military means everything. Trust. Respect. The acknowledgement that you've both been forged in the same fire. Take care of yourself, Ranger. Always, Captain. Dr. Mercer, in the interim, had been very busy. The federal investigation uncovered $847,000 in fraudulent medical equipment billing across 3 years. The arrests came down in phases, first the administrators, then the board members, then the contractors. Mercer's medical license was revoked at a hearing that lasted exactly 2 hours. The prosecution presented the IT logs. The federal agents testified. The young veteran from Platform 7 sat in the courtroom gallery and never looked away from Mercer's face, not even once. 6 months after his conviction, Dr. Mercer was driving a Medisupply van for a distribution contractor in Northern Virginia. The name tag on his uniform said Steve. He flinched when customers called him Doctor. His hands shook when he loaded boxes. He stopped eating lunch in the break room after the other drivers recognized him. One was a former nurse from Cedar Creek. He started taking his lunch breaks alone in the van, eating sandwiches with the doors locked. Elena didn't think about him anymore. She thought about the young veteran with the trembling hands. She thought about the 14 soldiers she'd carried out of the Hindu Kush. She thought about the ranger who whispered her call sign like a prayer. She thought about the flag in her locker and the next hand that would hold it. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the restraint of someone who had been forged in the worst places and still chose to stand in rooms where people were afraid, where people were broken, where people needed someone to tell them that survival was possible because someone had already survived. Like this video if you believe in honoring those who served. If you have military in your family, past or present, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. Subscribe and let's keep going.